Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's always a pleasure to attend a SKOCH event. I've known Samir Kochar for years and years, although it's a rum thing when he decides to switch from SKOCH to rum. Much of what happens at SKOCH events is, of course, a lot of bull, as you can see at the back. But one thing has always underlined everything that SKOCH has sought to do, including these events, including the magazine, including the awards, which is an emphasis on inclusion. There are many friends in the audience. I know some of them will be awarded. Several of them have written down the years. And amongst the audience present here, Montek is probably the senior most. In one form or another, they've all talked about poverty and inclusion. These two terms are related, but they're different. Poverty is an absolute notion. It has a bearing on whatever is the poverty line and however we choose to define the poverty line, which also requires data that one gets before one can go about estimating what percentage of the population is below the poverty line. Inequality tends to be much more contentious. But inequality fundamentally is a relative indicator. Inequality and perceptions about inequality not only depend on inequality in what, but inequality also tends to be a dynamic concept, or at least perceptions about inequality tend to be a dynamic concept. If I recall rightly, Montek himself said something like this in one of his papers. If I perceive that in future my lot is going to be better, if I perceive that my children are going to have a better life than I do, my perceptions about inequality tend to be different. Whether one is talking about poverty or whether one is talking about inequality, the more basic question to ask is, why are people poor? And no one is voluntarily poor. Certainly no one in the working age groups is voluntarily poor, unless the person happens to be disabled. So effectively it boils down to inclusion, or one definition of inclusion, which is to remove inequity in the provision of what broadly can be called inputs. They can be physical infrastructure, they can be social infrastructure, they can be financial inclusion, they can be technology, they can be credit, they can be access to markets. And in looking at this, to state the obvious, India is a very large country. India is a very heterogeneous country. And therefore, there is something that economists rarely pay attention to, which is that governance is also linked to the legal infrastructure. All of us as economists talk about markets. Markets are conceptual notions, but markets do not exist in a vacuum. Markets are not Azadpur mandis. The basic framework for a market is determined by the legal infrastructure, and I don't mean speed of dispute resolution and the backlog of cases. What I mean really is the Constitution. And the Constitution had a history. It started with the Government of India Act of 1919, and much of what we have in the Constitution today is based on the Government of India Act of 1935. What I particularly want to flag is the 7th schedule of the Constitution, which as of today has a union list, it has a state list, and it has a concurrent list. And these were based, as I said, on the Government of India Act of 1935. Whenever we are talking about inclusion, whenever we are talking about alleviating poverty, whenever we are talking about improving employment, we are also talking about the government not abdicating its responsibility. The government has to provide public goods, and I'm not using the expression public goods in the classic economist sense. And of course, the government also needs to subsidize to people who deserve beneficiaries. But when we say this, what do we mean by government? Because there are 3 layers of government. There's the union government, there is the state government, and there is local government. Whenever we are talking about public spending as economists, and typically several people will say, hey, look, we must spend 6% public money on education, 4% on health, 10% on infrastructure. But it's not simply about money and expenditure, it's also about the efficiency of that expenditure, and most of the items that we would regard as public goods in that loose sense are not delivered by union governments or are not delivered by state governments, they're delivered by local governments. And as everyone present here knows, the extent to which fiscal devolution and even decentralization of decision making to the local bodies, be it the panchayats or the urban local bodies, is left to the discretion of state governments. And my plea, because of my subjective interests, is the economist fraternity and sorority, I think, should pay greater attention to governance as determined and constrained by administration, which does not necessarily mean administration in Delhi or state capitals, but administration at the level of districts, administration at the level of the blocks, even further down. Because after all, inclusion is also about integrating the 125,000 villages out of the 600,000 villages that still remain somewhat marginalized. And on that inclusion agenda, I don't think there will be any disagreement amongst the economist fraternity and sorority assembled here, because that is what all these different people, and I'm familiar with not almost all their works, I think, have been writing about. Thank you.